Hello and welcome to this podcast episode of G-Talk Ask the Expert. GLP is a leading global investment manager and business builder in logistics, real estate, infrastructure, finance and related technologies, and in Europe claims over 30 years of experience in logistics real estate. Operating in 12 countries with over 4.5 million square metres of logistics space and another 3.4 million square metres awaiting development. They have over 10 billion euros worth of assets under management across Europe. Today I'm lucky to have two experts with me. I'm joined in the studio by Natalie Cooper, GLP Europe's Head of Portfolio and Asset Management and ESG.
Hello, Paul.
Hello, Natalie. And dialing in from Amsterdam, we have Sylvia Slaughter, who is a Senior Vice President in Fund Management at GLP Europe. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Paul.
So welcome to both of you. Perhaps I could start by asking you to say a little bit more about yourselves and what you do in the company. Natalie, I'll come to you first.
So I'm Natalie Cooper. I'm a Managing Director for GLP Europe. I joined the company in 2019 as a Head of Portfolio and Asset Management, and recently as well been appointed as the Head of ESG for Europe. I have over 22 years of experience in the real estate industry. I started my career as an asset manager and investment manager in retail for a global REIT, and I slowly moved to fund management when I moved to the UK.
And a REIT, just for those, is a real estate investment trust, so it's all part of the kind of funding experience, isn't it?
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to try to avoid the acronyms as much as I can. And then I moved to fund management, where I run real estate funds for institutional investment companies such as Aviva Investors and CBREGI.
Okay, and the same question to you, Sylvia.
Yeah, so I joined GLP in 2018. I've been in the real estate investment space for about 19 years now, the last 15 years of which have actually also been in fund management. But I actually started on the public market side. I was first working for a Canadian REIT. Later, I ended up for a European shopping center REIT before moving over to private equity fund management in 2008. That was actually for a logistics real estate fund manager, so really quite similar to GLP. And I've kind of been in the logistics real estate sector ever since. In 2016, I went back onto the public market side. This time I was leading the investor relations function for a logistics real estate REIT, and that was eventually bought out by Blackstone and privatized. And then in 2018, I moved over to Amsterdam and I joined GLP, and I came aboard to help build out the fund management function. At that time, we had maybe 2 real estate funds, and they were only a few months old. And later we launched a 3rd fund and a 4th fund, and we're now working on our 5th fund. And in that time, the fund management team went from just 2 of us to a team of 8 people.
Okay. Well, just winding back a little bit there, it's GLP and logistics. Perhaps we explain a little bit more about that and what it does. Natalie.
Sure. So GLP, we are investors, manager and developer of logistics space. So we're operating in 13 countries in Europe, including Luxembourg, but invested in 12. We have over 150 people across Europe, and we are specialized, as I say, in developing qualitative logistics space, but also taking care of the investment on behalf of our investors on the long term. So we've been in this area for over 30 years of experience. Okay.
Well, today we're going to be discussing both your areas of expertise and the interrelationship between fund management and ESG. Now, we've mentioned ESG, but without explaining the acronym. So ESG, for those who don't know, stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. For environmental, that's a measure of the impact a company has on its own environment, whether it's a carbon footprint, sustainability assessments, hazardous chemicals, and so on. The S is for social, and that's a measure of what kind of social impact a company has, both on its own workforce and on the broader community. And it can cover areas such as equality and diversity, hiring practices, and so on. And the governance part, how does a company's board and management fulfill its role and duties, including policies and practices to enhance transparency and accountability, as well as protecting interests of all its stakeholders? So that's everything from anti-bribery, corruption controls to issues surrounding executive pay to how well the leadership responds to and interacts with shareholders. So it's quite a broad set of responsibilities there. And Natalie, you're the head of that. We'll come to you in a little bit. But Sylvia, you touched on then the funds and how they're structured. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about them and how they're managed.
Yeah, sure. So, to complete basics, a fund is really just a pool of investor money, and it has a specific investment purpose or objective. At GLP Europe, currently, all our funds have a purpose to invest in logistics real estate. And we manage two types of funds, development funds and income funds. So an income fund targets a strategy of investment in real estate assets that are completed buildings, hopefully with a lease in place so it generates some income. And development funds target a different strategy of acquiring land sites and then developing a logistics building onto it. Funds can also have more narrow strategies that focus on specific countries, for instance, or different levels of risk or other specific strategies that it could take on. In GLP Europe, we currently have our 4 funds, 2 of which are income funds and 2 of which are development funds. And
you mentioned a 5th fund. Is that in process or about to open, or where's the 5th fund?
Yeah, we are working on a 5th fund, another income fund. There's been a little bit of press, I think, in the Property EU recently on it. And it is another income fund that we're currently targeting.
And then what's the typical size of these funds and also the length of time that you're investing for?
Well, the sizes tend to vary. Some of the development funds are about 1 billion, and the income funds are upwards to about 3 billion or so of billion euros of assets under management when it's fully stabilized. The life cycle of our funds, we typically target around 10-year life funds. So these are long-term vehicles in a long-term relationship that we enter in with investors.
Okay. So, Natalie, where does ESG fit with the fund management process then?
It's quite a central piece of the way we develop, invest and manage the real estate. GLP from the start took the position that if you want to do the things, do it right and do it well. So over 30 years ago, when we started building, we looked into sustainability very early on and looked at how we can produce and share some ideas and guidance for the entire industry and key logistics operator to just build better, build something that is better suited for the environment but also for the occupiers on site. So we actually delivered 30 years later on our first net zero building in the UK, which can tell you how much it takes time actually to nail it. But also it's a much more collaborative way of working with all your supply chain to ensure that every aspects are captured into the development angle.
And what is that first net zero building? Where is it?
It's in the UK. It's called Magnitude. It's a project we are extremely proud of because, as I said, it was just accumulation of know-how, expertise, and investigation and innovation thinking to deliver that building.
And GLP thinks of itself as having a leadership role in this territory, doesn't it?
We do. And we do it not only from being a developer of logistics space, but also in the sense of managing, real estate on behalf of all our stakeholders. So we think that this is an asset class where you can do not only looking at sustainable features, but it's also accounting for social value, how it fits in the environment. We have something quite central at GLP called the ecosystem and taking care about the entire bubble around the buildings, but bubble which is not only the building, but also the people that contribute and live within this bubble.
Okay. And so logistics has been on everyone's mind in recent times. How has that changed the world of logistics, do you think, Natalie? First Natalie, and then come to you, Sylvia.
Intensively. I started my career mainly in retail and office space and moved to logistics just because increasing demand, from investors, investors wanted to have more exposure to logistics sector, driven also by a lot of e-commerce penetration in each country. So the point of focus has really moved towards logistics. And with this came as much as, how do you create a good product? And all the attention from basically office space and retail start morphing or filtering through the logistic area. And you also had a lot of good skilled people transitioning from the traditional retail and office sector to logistics and bringing along with them some know-how, a different way of working and broadening their management, I would say, of this product. So it changed quite a lot. And I also believe that, we recently had the COVID pandemic, which has enhanced actually what can be done on the logistics sector.
And Sylvia, coming to you with that same question, how do you think that the recent events have altered the investment landscape as it pertains to logistics?
Well, I think it's really highlighted that logistics is kind of the backbone of the economy, and the essential services that run through. It does go through logistics, whether it's food or supplies or medicine or even some of our facilities that were related to the pandemic. But it was a catalyst as well for e-commerce.
Yes, a lot of us.
And I think it's really pushed people.
A lot of online shopping during lockdown happened, which altered the logistics landscape, I gather.
It did. And it altered, I think, some of the supply chain side of things too. So it was an extraordinary time, I think, globally. It's often uncomfortable to say words like we benefited in a global pandemic, but logistics was an industry that I think really just highlighted the essential nature of it into the economy. And so there was a lot of positive interest from tenants who needed more space, from investors who wanted to invest into the asset class. And we're coming out of the pandemic with a very heightened interest in logistics real estate.
So Natalie, tell me about the progress that GLP itself is making towards net zero.
Sure, Paul. I think as a business, we're also committed to be better in operating our own businesses. And we are not scared of being held accountable for how good we are or not actually operating our business. So 3 years ago, we decided to subscribe or commit to the Planet Mark accreditation, which is an organization that is actually measuring, validating your carbon footprint across your operations. So in our case, 13 offices now. And the purpose is that you commit to reduce every year at least 5% your carbon emissions in your operations. And in the third year, we've been awarded actually the accreditation. So something we are very proud of, and something that, again, it's not only about being an investor, developer, real estate, but how do you act up in ESG field as a business? So it's also very important for me, as head of ESG, that all our colleagues embark on the journey, that they feel rewarded, that the daily actions have a positive impact, not only on the investments, but how we act as citizens and the positive impact on the planet we can all do together.
And also then for individual buildings, there's the BREEAM accreditation and the well building standards. Tell us a little bit about those.
Correct. So the BREEAM certification is an environmental certifications about the building itself, how it account for sustainable features. So most of our buildings today are built at least at a very good standard or excellent, which is our goal. The WELL certification is about how operation and the well-being features within our buildings as well. So all our buildings are ready for WELL certifications as well.
Looking at then the relationship again between ESG and funds and, through the funds to investors, how do you communicate what you're doing in GLP to the investment community? Natalie?
Sure. One of the key for us has always been transparency, setting an objective, giving a trajectory, explaining to our investors, but all our stakeholders, what we're doing and how we're doing and why we're doing it, and then reporting back to investors. I must admit that sometimes it's still difficult to get the right data because we still have to build. We still need to understand what the standards, how we report. But being transparent has always been the underpinning value of our reporting process. So we actually take all our stakeholders and investors with us through the process. We're very open by saying maybe we're not there yet, but we are working on it and we'll come back to you and we'll report on that because that's an objective. So reporting for us has been some data-driven pool that we can actually set our performance against an objective, but also the narrative around why we're doing, how we're doing it. And as I said, it's not only about sustainability efficient buildings, but it's also about social value, well-being, promoting some deep, governance principles as well, being ethical and transparent in the way we do things.
And that's also then communicated within GLP. So ESG sits not only reporting to the investment community, but to your own workforce.
Completely. When I started by saying it's central to the way we work, it's because it affects everybody at GLP and it affects everybody in their own duties. So for us, everybody has a part to play in the ESG journey.
Okay, that's ESG within GLP, but let's take a look at the data. You mentioned reporting and the facts and figures that are both reported to the investment community. How is that collected and how do you keep on top of all the different standards within the different countries in which you operate? I'll come to you, Sylvia, for this question.
Sure. From an investor's perspective, I think with ESG, there's really two distinct points where investors will focus on ESG. The first is when the investor is doing their initial due diligence before they invest into a fund. And the second is after they've invested in the fund, and there's the regular reporting they get from us as the manager. So, to that first, that due diligence that the investor does before they invest their money, there are many different ways an investor can approach this. Some investors will have their own tailor-made questionnaires, whereas others will leverage off of industry organizations such as INREV. And INREV is the European Association for Investors in Non-Listed Real Estate Vehicles. It's an industry organization that the goal is just to improve transparency and professionalism and develop best practices across the sector. And INREV itself produces a lot of different tools for real estate fund management industry. One of them is their standardized due diligence questionnaire. And so this is just the standard list of questions that helps investors structure their questions to help them really assess if this fund, meets their investment objectives or not. And I actually sit on that committee within INREV, on the due diligence committee, with several other peers in the industry. And ESG has actually been a topic that we've been working on within the committee for the last number of years. Last year, we actually released a new climate risk appendix. And this year, we're working within the committee on releasing another appendix that's actually dedicated to the S in ESG, to the social side. But, I think ESG is it's becoming such an increasingly important consideration in decision-making process of investors. And it's also something that's just continually evolving. So some of these, bespoke ESG appendix questionnaires, I think, can really help frame investors' questions in terms of what policies, procedures, what is our approach to ESG? How do we manage it? And how do we, assess really the risks? That second point, though, like after they've invested and they've passed their due diligence and now they're invested in the fund, we move to the more, regular measurement and reporting of the fund. And I think one key tool that we use is GRESB. That's the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And GRESB itself was an investor-driven organization. It was formed by, I think, largely European investors. And they have a goal in their benchmark to provide kind of their framework to collect and compare key ESG indicators and any other related performance metrics to, assess across the global real estate and infrastructure portfolios, some sort of ESG performance indicators. And GLP, we've been a contributor to GRESB since 2013. And in Europe, we now actually report all our European funds into that benchmark.
So that's a comprehensive industry-wide benchmarking through GRESB. You also got this investor due diligence, which is part of the process of before people will invest in a fund. And some of that is bespoke to those institutional investment organizations. But what are some of the other tools of benchmarking that you might do within GLP as part, which you sort of take on as part of a leadership role? Natalie?
So we looked a lot into technologies to start with. because we consider if you need to report on data, you need to be consistent in reporting data, knowing what you report on. So we invested in bespoke tools to be able to gather the data and start creating our own baseline. And with this pool of information, just starting to appreciate the differences between our own real estate and start building your in-house benchmarking that you can then transfer or layer on top of market benchmarking like GRESB. So I find GRESB as a useful tool. It helps you to know as a business where you sit against your peer group. It also tries to give you a little bit of a trajectory of the trends and proactively adapt or consider things that you might not have looked into. But I always believe that you need to look at things from different angles and with different tools. So GRESB is very useful, but we should, us as a leader in the real estate and logistics sphere, we should widening horizon and also start pulling together all this information we already have in-house and start to build our own in-house benchmark, understand a little bit more and deeper our real estate.
Yes, you're conducting your own ESG due diligence on assets now, aren't you?
That is correct. So ESG, as I said, is part of our investment decision process, and it's translated through, at the time we buy an asset, through the management. So it's completely filtered through everything we do in real estate. Our ESG due diligence is all about assessing the environmental sustainability factors to investment, but also going through the social impact. So very early on defining if you're contributing positively or not. And then if you don't, what you can do to remedy, but also through the life cycle of the real estate, what you can do to maintain either the high quality of the building and the performance from an ESG standpoint, but also moving forward, going ahead. And with the partnership with our customers on site, I think that's how you achieve it best, because we are convinced, and I am convinced personally, that this is not working in isolation. We need to think about it, as I said, the ecosystem, the entire bubble, how we can work together in partnership to enhance ESG features through the buildings.
Well, that's also, I mean, everyone's mind is turning to COP26 and the environmental zero carbon world that we're all going to be heading into. So that's going to introduce a new set of regulations and targets that's going to be imposed on buildings themselves and will be at the forefront of the investor community. How is the investor appetite changing as a result of this climate change risk that's emerging, Sylvia?
I think the climate change is definitely a big focus in Europe recently. As I mentioned earlier, the work with INREV, like our industry organization, they released the appendix specific for climate risks in the summer of 2020. And so I think that kind of speaks to how top of mind it is within the investor community, that they're kind of looking at it saying, this is something very important, and this is something we want some good tools to be able to, like, how to frame our thoughts around it, what questions should we be asking, and how should we be approaching thinking about, these climate risks.
What are the sort of regulations and targets that you have approaching from the investment that are being imposed by the investment community?
Well, with regards to governments and regulations, I mean, Europe is a super interesting place. I think when you think about around the world, Europe is probably one of the most comprehensive regulations that, kind of exist around the world. I mean, fund management itself, it's a regulated business in Europe. We are regulated under what's called the AIFMD, and that stands for Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive. This is something that was put back into place in Europe in 2013. It's an EU initiative. It was aiming to kind of harmonize in all the rules for the management and the marketing of these so-called alternative investment funds. And these are funds like what we manage, our, private equity real estate funds. The actual goal of the regulation was protecting investors, increasing transparency, reducing systematic risk, and then, enhancing some market efficiency. But I mean, what really all it does is it just lays out a set of rules for fund managers around how we internally organize ourselves, how we market the funds, how we raise private capital. and also about the risk monitoring and, other policies. But, more recently, there have been sustainability related disclosures that have been incorporated into this regulation.
I suppose I'm also then asking what is the balance between, obviously the investors are interested in the yield and capital growth in a fund, but what's their appetite? How's that changing through climate change?
One of the struggles we currently have in the real estate industry is the standards. It's understanding where the regulations are going. I think there's more and more pressure from international bodies and governments to actually make things much more regulated to ensure that the Paris Agreement commitment will actually be crystallized and people are all delivering on those. The issue is still something that is in the making. So we have different deadlines, we have different standards being communicated, and we even reading through them and the guidance, it's really hard to make something very tangible and clear. So I think the entire industry is almost looking for something that is simple, that you can understand, that there is a normalization of standards. So we know that you compare same set of data, same set of performance, but also that the longevity of these standards are here to stay.
Okay.
Because what happened over the last 10 years is you have a lot of good ideas and programs. You engage, you commit to them, and they disappear. And then you start from scratch again.
Okay.
So I think as logistics or real estate actually players, we're looking at something much more sustainable, long-term, with clear guidance. So we all know not only how we compare to each other and what we're doing, but we also understand how people are doing or delivering ESG.
But specifically, then what about the ESG due diligence toolkit?
It's basically our ESG toolkit has been put together looking at different standards, international standards, and the most similar factors have been gathered into our document. And they said that should cover 95% of things that we should be looking at from a sustainability perspective, social and governance perspective.
Yeah.
And that help us then through at the inception of, an investment or development to look at all these factors and at least consider them. Don't ignore them.
And what then specifically within buildings, the environmental aspect is probably one of the easiest to measure and provide the data for. How do you approach the development of new buildings?
So you have the life cycle assessment, which is a way to calculate actually the emission of the carbon footprint through the construction phase, the operation of the assets. So that's a way to actually quantify how much of emissions of CO2 you're going to release in the air.
Yes, we've got those three sort of areas of environmental measurement, I suppose. One is during the construction, you've got sustainable architecture and the construction process. The other is once the building is built, how much carbon is embodied in that building and also its operational efficiency. And then you've got this whole life, what happens when the building is taken apart and recycled. Correct.
So the construction phase is called the embodied carbon. And this actually, the issue with that is not reversible. So whatever emission or whatever carbon footprint released in the air, it's here forever. So that's one of the areas where we as a developer, we know that we can have a meaningful impact. And these are the aspects of the development where we really look into how do we build buildings which have lesser impact on the environment through the materials, through the layout, through design tricks, through reusing some existing materials. So these are all the elements that are considered at the development phase.
The energy use of a building is obviously paramount. And that's a good chance to take a look at what's next because, Natalie, what's GLP's approach to renewable energy?
Of course, Paul. I think we cannot talk about reduction of CO2 emissions without talking about renewable energy solutions. I think we already implemented a wide range of measures in our portfolio to decrease actually the operational carbon footprint. So we implemented LED lighting, the use of smart metering, the sustainable design features to improve efficiency throughout the use of the assets. But we know that the decarbonization goals are quite ambitious and could be challenging. So the next step for us is definitely to transition quickly to renewable energies. And we are at GLP on the path to net zero. So we want to ensure that we make the best use of the roofs that we have under management.
Yes, you built some quite large buildings, and so you've got quite a lot of roof space to play with.
Exactly. And these can be optimized, from an investor perspective, because you can rentalize the space, but also you can use it as a source of energy for operating your buildings. And we know that for a lot of occupiers, the energy bill is quite high. So renewable energy is also not only doing the good thing for the planet, but is also reducing your operational cost. And that can be up to 30% for an occupier. So it's quite a big cost for them as an operator. So at GLP, as I said, globally, that's not only Europe, that's one of our trajectory is to promote and carry on promoting renewable energy to meet also our targets. And we have installed over the globe, actually, 224 megawatts in 2020. And this is just going to go more and more, increasing our footprint in installing renewable energy capacities.
Okay. And Sylvia, what's next for you? What do you see coming down the track?
Well, I think we're a constantly growing business. And I think, as Natalie said earlier, like, we're evolving, we're on a journey. And I think, we've built a really good in-house team. In my opinion, I think the team is excellent. We have deep experience in fund, portfolio management, asset investment, risk management. And I think it's just a really exciting place to be in fund management. And I think the growth will continue, and we'll see more exciting things in the future.
Well, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. A special thank you to my guest, Natalie Cooper.
Thank you, Paul.
And to Sylvia Slaughter.
Thanks so much.
My name is Paul Shearer. Thanks for listening. And thanks for listening to this episode of G-Talk Ask the Expert. Be sure to subscribe to future episodes wherever you download your podcasts from. And to find out more, visit the website at eu.glp.com.